Yeah, thank you, statement.
Doing, Ralph? This hearing will come to order. I appreciate the presence of our witnesses because of we've had recent votes. I apologize for the delay, but we're very glad you're all here. We're also waiting on a fellow member who undoubtedly is tied up with some other committee business, Mr. Hinojosa. We hope will be here shortly. If he arrives, we'll insert him into the proceedings as well. I want to first welcome everyone and thank you all for coming to this afternoon's hearing on improving the laboratory experience for America's high school students. This is particularly exciting for me. It marks the very first hearing of the Research and Science Education Subcommittee for this Congress, and I want to take just a moment to express how pleased I am to be able to chair this particular subcommittee. I want to especially thank my good friend and colleague, Ranking Member Dr. Ehlers, who was the leader of this very committee until recently. He has been a true leader on Science Committee in general, has extensive knowledge of and experience with the important issues that come before this committee, and I look forward to drawing upon his knowledge and his friendship, and also working together in a bipartisan manner throughout this Congress. I'm pleased to be leading the subcommittee on the Republican side, and also I'm glad to see Mr. Hall here. Oh, Mr. Hinojosa is here. Well, Ruben, welcome. We're just getting started, so come on up, my friend, and we'll start with you once I get through all my initial palaver. I also want to acknowledge, though she's not with us today, she's on the Democratic side, Eddie Bernice Johnson, who preceded me as the Democratic lead on this subcommittee in her role as ranking member. I intend to continue her good work and especially her commitment to math and science education, particularly as it pertains to underrepresented communities. I'm pleased that Ms. Johnson has decided to continue her service on this committee. As it's the first committee hearing, I want to take just a brief moment to offer a few observations of how I'll approach this committee, and hopefully that will set the stage for some of what we'll do in the future. I would say at the start that long before I was in Congress, I was a scientist. I hold a doctorate in clinical psychology, specialized in neuropsychology. And science is not just a committee I serve on, as I know it's the same with Dr. Ehlers. This is something that's in our blood. We are scientists. We're passionate about it. And I'm passionate about it not just as a scientist, but as a member of Congress. I believe that reason, informed by fact, is a pretty darn good way to lead your life, and it's a very good way to make public policy. And we're not alone in that. Those who know the history of this great country know that some of our greatest founders, Franklin especially, but also Jefferson and Washington as well, had a passionate commitment to science and to investigative research as a way to guide agriculture as well as public policy. At the same time, because I've been in the scientific field, I recognize that science has its share of problems and there is room for improvement. And I want to underscore from the outset that ultimately government-funded scientific research, as important as it is, exists by taking the hard-earned money of taxpayers who could use that money in countless other ways to fund their health care, to send their kids to school, to pay for their house, you name it. And they take that money, we as government take that money from hard-working taxpayers, and we give it to scientists to conduct their studies. That seems to me to place a particular responsibility on the scientists who receive such funds. Simply put, if someone cannot explain why it's worthwhile to take another person's hard-earned money to do a study, maybe that study should not be done. And I know that's a strong principle, and I am passionate about science, but I believe scientists have a responsibility to recognize where the money comes from that funds their studies. I also believe that because we place such a high premium and value on scientific research, it's especially incumbent upon the scientific community to hold themselves to the highest standards of integrity, objectivity, and honesty when reporting scientific information not only to the Congress but to the broad scientific community. We make important decisions based on the work of scientists, and the onus is on them to make sure their work merits that credibility. I recognize fully that many times scientific research at the initial stages is not always transparent in terms of how it might be applied down the road. But I would urge all scientists, especially those receiving government funds, to ask themselves at some point, how do I justify that to the crab fisherman on the Pacific coast, or the logger in the mountains, or the farmer in Kansas, or the steel worker in Pennsylvania who have given their money to fund my research? And we'll keep that in mind as we proceed through this Congress and through this committee. I finally want to say this. I believe that one of the great things about science is it should not be partisan. Information, reason, informed discussion has no preference necessary for one party or another. I have come to learn since I've been in Congress there are many good ideas on both sides of the aisle, and we should listen to them regardless of which side they come from. I've also come to believe there are many stupid ideas on both sides of the aisle, and we should evaluate them accordingly. But on this committee, I'll say to my friend Mr. Ehlers, Mr. Hall, I look forward to working with you. If you folks have some things we can work on together, by all means, let's do it. And as we're working forward on issues coming from our side, we'll approach you and see how we can make it better for everybody concerned. So thank you for your leadership. And with that, I want to say that turning to today's testimony, I want to particularly welcome Congressman Hinojosa, who's appearing before us. He has introduced H.R. 524, a bill that would authorize the National Science Foundation to make matching grants to partnerships between high schools and institutions of higher education, businesses, or other community organizations to explore ways to improve science labs for students. These grants will be used for teacher training and development, equipment and facilities, and curriculum development. The research and demonstration projects will be focused on improving labs at high schools, serving large populations of students underrepresented in science and math careers today. Studies show it's these kids at the lowest rungs of the socioeconomic ladder who are most lacking this valuable learning experience. How valuable is the lab experience for teaching science, and what's wrong with the labs in high school now? The National Research Council brought attention to this issue in 2005 with their report, America's Lab Report, Investigation in High School Science. The report presents an in-depth look at the problems plaguing the effective use of what many consider to be an integral part of learning science. To be sure, languishing facilities and old equipment are problems. The report, though, brings attention to the non-physical issues such as inadequate teacher training and preparation, lab exercises not designed to fit with classroom curricula, and state science standards that are too extensive to actually allow time in the laboratory. This subcommittee is devoted to improving science education, so devoted that we added science education to the name of the subcommittee itself. We're concerned that American students are not achieving their potential in science and math education. It's a concern as we look at competing in a knowledge-based global economy for the high-paying technology jobs, but at all levels of our economy, folks need to have an understanding of science and math in order for them to succeed as individuals and our nation to succeed as a country. Improving K-12 science education is the ultimate key to the future prosperity and strength of our nation, as the National Academy pointed out in its report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm. Improving K-12 education needs to be the keystone of any innovation agenda. I look forward to the hearing from our witnesses today, and I want to recognize, Dr. Ehlers for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your new post. We welcome you to that. I've always admired your honesty and your integrity in dealing with issues, and I totally agree with you. Science is not partisan. Science policy can be partisan, but the science itself should not be. And I might just add an editorial comment that I'm upset at all those people who are trying to label the current White House as not being scientifically correct, and I recognize some members of the administration might be, but I have watched presidents over the years. Most of them are not very good at science. Most of them are not very good at using science, and I find it very disturbing that in spite of that record, and I don't think President Bush is any worse than anyone else who came along, probably somewhat better, but a pseudo-scientific group and certain scientists are trying to make science a partisan issue in the White House, and I don't think that's either helpful or appropriate. Let me also say, picking up on your comment about the justifying the use of taxpayers' money. I totally agree with you, and I remember Chairman Sensenbrenner's frequent question when he chaired the full committee of science, and people would come to him and ask, science would come to him and ask for money for their particular projects. His first question always was, have you talked to your Rotary Club about this? And this just sets them back. Why should I talk to my Rotary Club? And his answer was simply, if you can't sell it to your local Rotary Club, how do you expect me to sell it to the Congress? And that's the key point. All scientists should be out selling their particular work to the public so they know what's being done, and the public will come to appreciate it. Having said that, let me give a somewhat more formal statement. Laboratory experiences are a significant part of the greater issue of improving STEM education in our nation. U.S. science literacy is weak at the K-12 levels compared to other countries, and our universities are burdened with a tremendous amount of remedial work in these areas. I am constantly on a mission to find ways that we can strengthen our system of education at all levels to incorporate support for STEM teachers and students. STEM, of course, standing for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I am very pleased that my colleague, Representative Hinojosa, has introduced a bill to improve high school laboratory science, particularly for those in the highest need. I expect that witnesses' reflections on laboratory science and the proposed legislation will be an invaluable part of the committee process. There is clearly a need to improve upon high school laboratory experiences. One of the conclusions of the National Research Council's report on lab science was that educators and researchers do not agree on how to define high school lab science. This is a fundamental and necessary place to start. In fact, the NRC report found that there are such limited data on typical laboratory experiences that it is difficult to draw any conclusions about their effect on student learning. The experts on the NRC panel scrutinized the strengths of integrated lab experiences and discovered that a lab is only helpful when it is fully integrated into the learning process. Additionally, the report revealed there is a dearth of research in this area, and students across the nation could benefit from a study on the best way to establish a successful laboratory. Let me also add a parenthetical note about why laboratory instruction is so essential today. 150 years ago, over 90% of the people in this country lived on farms. And I don't know how many present have lived on a farm or worked on a farm. I grew up in a farming community, and every child who grows up on a farm learns physics by using the equipment on a farm. Today, only a small fraction of our population is on the farm, approximately 2%. That means 98% of our population is likely not experiencing the use of physics and physical equipment before they get into the schools, particularly high school. So it is essential for us to give them that experience that used to come with ordinary life, but no longer does. Another aspect of this is that Nobel laureate Carl Wieman, who has been working in this area for years now. In fact, he has recently decided to work full-time on improving science education. During his tenure at the University of Colorado, he developed a physics educational technology project using simulations for both teaching and learning physics, and has made them freely available through a website. These simulations emphasize the connections between real-life phenomena and the underlying science and draw heavily on prior research findings. Though Dr. Wieman's project was far from a traditional or even hands-on type of laboratory, the undergraduate physics students who used the simulations showed an increased mastery of concepts. In one of his research papers, Dr. Wieman concluded that many physicists find it quite mysterious and somewhat disturbing that carefully developed simulations are more educationally effective than real hardware. In other words, simply saying we have to have laboratory experiments may not be the entire answer, may not even be the correct answer. Perhaps simulations may be more effective. Again, that is something that should be studied. As the National Research Council High School Lab Report also determined, I think that more evidence is necessary to determine what an effective laboratory looks like. I look forward to the discussion about developing integrated laboratories and to learn from our witnesses. All of them have tremendous experience in the trenches, and I welcome them here today. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. If there are any other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record. At this time, I'd like to introduce the witness for our first panel, Congressman Ruben Hinojosa from Texas, the author of H.R. 524. Ruben, we're pleased to have you appear before us today to talk about your bill. I now recognize my friend from Texas for his testimony.
Good afternoon. Is the microphone on? I would like to thank Chairman Baird and Ranking Member Ehlers and all the members of the subcommittee for giving me the opportunity to present testimony on a pressing need, access to high-quality laboratory science in our high schools. I would especially like to thank my fellow Texan Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson and Chairman of the full committee, Congressman Bart Gordon, for their advice and support in developing H.R. 524, the Partnerships for Laboratory Science Act, or better known as PALS, which we are here to discuss today. I would like to express my appreciation to the STEM education community, particularly the chairs of the STEM Education Coalition, James Brown of the American Chemical Society and Jody Peterson of the National Science Teachers Association, for their advocacy and on behalf of opportunities for our young people, and for their commitment to ensuring that we do not lose future scientists and engineers because they did not get preparation in laboratory science in high school. We have major holes in our pipeline for preparing future professionals in science, technology, engineering, and math, better known as the STEM fields. None is more glaring than the lack of preparation for college-level work for the students graduating from high schools that have high concentrations of poor and minority students. The National Science Foundation commissioned a study by the National Research Council on the state of America's high school labs. I would like to draw your attention to two glaring findings in that report. One, the current quality of laboratory experiences is poor for most students, and educators and researchers do not agree on what constitutes an adequate high school laboratory, hampering the accumulation of research on how to improve labs. Second finding, schools with higher concentrations of non-Asian minorities and schools with higher concentration of poor students are less likely to have adequate laboratory facilities than other schools. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the rest of my statement be included in the record because I'd like to speak from personal experience of what I have seen in the good laboratories and in the poor ones. I come from an area in South Texas that is 250 miles south of San Antonio. The area is 80% Hispanic and an area that has for too many years been neglected. We didn't see a sitting president in that area from 1953 to 1998 for 45 consecutive years. Shameful. Big neglect. So I can tell you that the area is now progressing because we have been investing in human capital, in education of public schools, in colleges and universities, and other infrastructure projects that are helping that area prosper. But I want to share with you that we have the South Texas Independent School District with 5 magnet schools, 2 of which are listed in the top 1,000 high schools in the country. The Math and Science Academy is in the top 10 and has been for 3 consecutive years. And then the Allied Health is a magnet school that is really focusing on allied science, allied health careers. and nursing, and we have produced a lot of practicing medical doctors. And the important thing is that we focused a great deal on the science labs. Why? Because as one of the members of the Education Committee here in Congress, I went to visit Thomas Jefferson High School. And that is in Northern Virginia and always among the top producers of National Merit Scholars. It's amazing that they can produce 70 semifinalists for that designation, and that out of those 70 semifinalists, 40 got the National Merit Scholarship. And so that is proof that what I'm going to say makes a big difference. And that is that when I took a delegation from the Math and Science Academy of South Texas, there were about 10 men and women who worked there, the superintendent, several of the professors, and several school board members. And we noted that their laboratories was the most exciting thing that the students had in their rigorous educational program. You couldn't get a job at that school because nobody wants to quit. They had teachers with masters and PhDs. And the students, you couldn't get them out because they had such exciting projects. All this to say that we know that it works because we now have 2 schools in the top 100 in the nation, an area that has more migrant children than any other region in the country. And when they featured it in one of the business periodicals, it was interesting that they selected a child from a migrant family who scored 1,500 on her SAT. And so good are the SATs and ACT scores that they're recruited from the best Ivy League schools in the country, East Coast to West Coast. Full scholarships, and 97% of their graduates are going on to college. Folks, there's no doubt in my mind that we're on the right track with this legislation. I'm pleased to tell you that in just a short while this afternoon, less than 45 minutes, I gathered 40 co-sponsorships to add to the original 30 sponsors of this legislation for a total of 70 bipartisan members of Congress asking me, what has taken you so long? Also, I'm pleased to report to the committee that Senator Menendez over in the Senate side is offering the mirror legislation that we have in the House. And so I believe that we just simply need to raise the level of awareness of the condition of our science labs and get the appropriators to build up some courage and invest in our high school labs, and I think that things are going to really improve. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, and unless there are any urgent questions on any members of the committee, as is the custom, we'll excuse the gentleman and thank him very much for his testimony, for his leadership on this. You speak with great passion and experience, and we would hope that we could, in all of our districts and across this country, replicate the kind of successes you've described. Thank you very much, Ruben, for your leadership on this. At this time, I would like to introduce the witnesses on our second panel, and Hinojosa wishes to stay, is of course welcome to. If he needs to go, we understand that as well. First is Dr. Arthur Eisenkraft, a distinguished professor of science education and director of the Center for Science and Math in Context at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He also served on the National Research Council committee that authored America's Lab Report, Investigations in High School Science. Next is Ms. Linda Froschauer, president of the National Science Teachers Association. She's also the K-8 Science Department Chair for the Western Public Schools of Weston, Connecticut. Weston Public Schools, not Western. And Dr. Jerry Mundell is a chemistry professor at Cleveland State University in Cleveland, Ohio, where he serves as coordinator of the Freshman Chemistry Committee. I would remind our witnesses that spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each. You've got those little lights there. My dear friend Dr. Ehlers, and when he was chair, reminded people that At the yellow light, you should pay close attention because when the light turns red, a trapdoor emerges beneath your chair and you will disappear from view. We have modified that. It will still apply to the witnesses. It now also applies to the members as well. When we exceed our time commitment, there's a trapdoor and we'll be gone 2 floors down and picked up by the maintenance later in the day. But seriously, we look forward very much to the testimony. You've done some great work. We look forward to hearing about it, particularly in the concept of the outstanding legislation introduced by Mr. Hinojosa. Dr. Eisenkraft, please.
Well, as the spring baseball and softball season begins, I thought it would be good to take a moment to imagine 2 teams getting ready for this season. Both teams have fans and baseball players and good coaches, and one of them gets to practice with bats and balls and gets on the field, and the other gets to watch videotapes and learn and read books about baseball. And we have to wonder, which team would you rather have your child on? Who's going to do better this season? Well, it's a silly question to ask because the answer is obvious. You want the team who can practice, and yet the same situation, a parallel situation, exists today in our high school labs, where some students get the opportunity to investigate the processes of science by doing science, while others get to hear about science, listen to people tell about science, and perhaps watch videotapes. The National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences produced this study at the request of the National Science Foundation. 8 of my colleagues and some staff members worked on this for a good amount of time, and we agreed on a definition of laboratory experiences, and we looked at the goals and effectiveness of labs in America. The legislation considered here corresponds to 2 of the conclusions reached here, related conclusions. One was that labs on the whole are not doing what we thought they would be doing. They're poor in most respects. And also that in spite of how poor those labs are, children in poor communities aren't even getting those labs, and children who are lower in academic ability in affluent school districts are not getting those labs either. So why do we care about lab experiences? Why are the poor quality of labs and the unavailability of labs to segments of our population concerns? So no amount of watching other people do science is an adequate substitute for doing science oneself. For 25 years, I've watched my wife. She takes these 2 sticks, and she goes like this. And then a sweater pops out after a certain amount of time. And now I've watched this for 25 years with care. And what are the chances you think if you gave me some yarn and some knitting needles, I could make a sweater? Well, most people don't give me a 50-50 chance or even a 10% chance. Only the kindest people give me a 1% chance. Most people say you have no chance, and yet we think, though, that students can watch somebody else do science and they'll be able to figure it out. If I can't do it with knitting a sweater, I don't think why you think they'll be able to do it by doing that. That's one reason we have labs, to provide these experiences to students. But the other reason is related to the common experience. There was a study in the New York Times 3 years ago which showed the television viewing habits of black and white Americans. Out of the top 10 television programs, only 2 were in common on both lists. What that meant to me was that every time I give a television reference in class, I was disenfranchising students in the school who were not like me. That same thing exists in all segments of our society. So every textbook in science talks about waves in the harmonic oscillators or whatever, and they all say, like the waves at the beach. Well, I'll tell you, there are kids in Boston and kids in Los Angeles who have never been to the beach, and it's only 5 miles from their house. So I have no idea what kids in Nebraska are thinking when they read in the book, like the waves at the beach. What we do in the lab is we give people a tub of water, they slosh it back and forth, they make observations, they make measurements, they draw conclusions based on that with that, so that we don't have to assume that the only people who will make understandings of this are the ones who were lucky enough to vacation at the beach in some part of their house, some part of their lives. We need these kinds of experience in order to level the playing field of all the students. Once we figure out that we need labs, we have to figure out how to do them better. How do we integrate them into the instructional units? How do we make them meaningful? How do we give them context? How do we use the best learning from the cognitive psychology research in order to help them? If Olympic teams were performing as poorly as our students are in international competitions, there would be a national cry for more attention, for improved coaching, for more opportunity, for better equipment. We should have the same sense of urgency for our students. Instead of just being science students, they can be student scientists. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Froschauer.
Thank you for this opportunity to present testimony on behalf of the National Science Teachers Association. I'm Linda Froschauer, and I'm the president of NSTA. I'm also an 8th grade science teacher and science department chair in Weston, Connecticut. And I've been science teacher for over 32 years now. The National Science Teachers Association is committed to promoting excellence and innovation in science teaching and learning for all. And we provide our members with a variety of resources and support, including high-quality professional development, publications, networking opportunities, and curriculum materials. NSTA strongly supports H.R. 524 and the Partnerships for Access to Laboratory Science grants. We applaud the Science Committee for realizing the importance of high school laboratory experiences and for its leadership and dedication to this issue. The PALS legislation would create a pilot program at NSF to study the best ways to train teachers in lab instruction, the best way to set up, staff, and manage labs, and ensure that those labs have the best possible equipment, materials, and supplies. The PALS bill will help fill our gaps in knowledge in a way that will make it possible for a large range of schools to benefit from the results of the pilot research program. So why is PALS necessary? A 1995 report from the U.S. General Accounting Office titled School Facilities, America's Schools Not Designed or Equipped for the 21st Century found that 42% of all schools surveyed nationally reported they were not well at all equipped in the area of laboratory science. A second GAO report in 2005 titled Federal Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics Programs and Related Trends found that approximately 40% of those college students who left the science fields reported some problems related to high school science preparation. The under-preparation was often linked to problems such as not understanding calculus and the lack of laboratory experience. We know we have many challenges ahead in our efforts to reform and strengthen the science education that we provide to students. For science to be taught properly and effectively, labs must be an integral part of the science curriculum. But in many schools, lab science is done poorly or not at all. And several days ago, we asked NSTA members via email to tell us about the lab experience in their school. Hundreds of teachers told us about the poor state of the lab facilities and instruction in their schools and the challenges that they face in providing a quality lab experience for students. This urban teacher wrote, "In my urban inner city school, I teach a lab science in an old business room. There are no tables, benches, water, or gas service, no sinks, fire extinguisher, eye wash stations, fire blankets, or any other equipment." Another teacher told us, "I have no specific safe area in which to conduct labs. My yearly budget is the same as it was 12 years ago. I must purchase all of my equipment and supplies. I have no safety equipment other than a portable eye wash station and a fire extinguisher. My district claims that labs are extracurricular and not mandated by my subject. My kids are accustomed to labs using kitchenware or materials I have purchased at Walmart. They have no idea how to use scientific equipment or even what it looks like due to lack of funding." This biology teacher wrote, "I've been teaching high school biology for 10 years. I have old microscopes that I could actually swap out for Coke bottles and not even notice the difference. However, the greatest problem I see is my lack of skill in the area of lab investigations. I agree that this is the best source of learning that my kids can get, but I simply don't have the skill to design these labs." Safety is a huge concern. We do not have any rooms to use as actual laboratories. Although we have lots of equipment, we have no place to safely use it, and few teachers who know how to use it. Currently, the one room that had been a lab is used by teachers to sell hot chocolate and nachos to students to raise money for trips to Washington, D.C. for a very small group of students. The lab cannot be used as a lab. They remove the tables and replace them with desks. And finally, we heard this from a teacher who confesses about his own shortcomings in the classroom. I've not learned how to facilitate real thinking and essential planning for authentic lab experiences. I don't know what students really need in an introductory chemistry experience at the high school level, and I cannot figure out how to teach logical thinking and sequencing to over 20 students in a lab at the same time. In conclusion, HR 524 partnership grants can be instrumental in helping schools to develop and maintain a safe, well-equipped lab space and bring ongoing professional development to teachers. Thank you.
Dr. Mundell.
While preparing my testimony for the subcommittee, I decided to confront my general chemistry class with some background questions concerning their high school laboratory experiences. My survey consisted of several questions to which the 66 students responded with their clickers. Here's some samples of the questions and their responses. Did the lab portion of your high school course help you to better understand chemical concepts? 44% agreed. Did the lab portion of your high school chemistry course stimulate your interest in chemistry? Now only 33% agreed. And finally, did the lab portion of your high school chemistry course help to prepare you for your college chemistry course? Only 21% agreed. Early in my career, first as an industrial research chemist at the Lubrizol Corporation and later while working on my doctorate degree at Case Western, I found laboratory routine and research the most vibrant part of my work. Whether it was a problem involving chemical synthesis or the employment of investigative techniques to characterize substances, the physical pursuit of the science was always pulling me back into the laboratory. It is the nature of this physical pursuit which can inform and sometimes enlighten, and within the proper setting such as a high school laboratory, even provide opportunities of growth and inspiration. Traditionally, these opportunities do not occur in the normal experiences found in high school science labs, which are highly structured around classical laboratory techniques and chemical syntheses. It should be our chief concern to replace these traditional high school lab exercises with experiences of exploration and discovery. With the participation of local colleges and universities, such laboratory experiences may be developed and readily accessible to area high school students. An example of such a program is now ongoing at Cleveland State University. CSU is participating in a 5-year NSF-funded program which provides such opportunities for its undergraduate students. The Research Experience to Enhance program, which is REEL, addresses the issue of student experiencing the discipline of chemistry through participation in actual research situations. Instead of performing a series of lab experiments listed on a syllabus, the students learn to design and execute green chemistry experiments performed on local environmental samples. During the course of the semester, students utilize many of the topics covered in the corresponding general chemistry lecture, in addition to advanced laboratory instrumentation and techniques unavailable to students enrolled in traditional general chemistry lab courses. The assessment at the end of the course is based on individual PowerPoint presentations of each student's research, accompanied by their written write-ups. Students also are encouraged to publish in research journals such as Journal of Undergraduate Research, as well as making presentations at the Real Chemistry Symposiums and local ACS meetings in miniature. Although this particular program is set up on the university campus, with additional funding and proper training of school teachers, this type of program could be offered at a secondary school level. Within this type of laboratory experience, students are soon to acquire a sense of ownership of the subject. Participating in actual research situations instills maturity in students. They are no longer just learning for the grade, but instead applying their knowledge to real-life problem solving. But this depth of experience for students would only come with a similar depth of commitment from the teachers. In conclusion, I strongly support House Bill H.R. 524, especially subparagraph B, Article 5, which identifies a need of funding for professional development and training for teachers. Am I done? As important as supplies, equipment, and well-constructed laboratories are in the implementation of a viable teaching program, I strongly believe that the failure of our high school students to successfully participate in college-level science curriculum is in part due to our failure to inspire them. This inspiration This inspiration can only come from well-informed teachers with strong attachments to their subjects. Good science teachers need to be well-grounded in their turf. They need opportunities outside of the normal coursework to continually develop not only as teachers but also as scientists. And this can evolve by building closer associations between the secondary school teachers and the college and university research faculty. By implementing programs which enable school teachers to actively participate in summer research opportunities within their area universities, high school teachers would better be able to appreciate and understand the nature of science. Thank you.
I thank our witnesses. Will now begin a round of questioning, and I'll begin with myself, yield myself 5 minutes, and then we'll yield to Mr. Hall after that. I find this very troubling, as I'm sure you do. Ms. Froschauer, your description of the teachers who had no labs, no rooms to conduct the labs, what did they do? In the absence of this, what did they do to try to help young people learn science?
Well, obviously, if they have no lab facilities, it certainly isn't lab-oriented. However, I do believe that most teachers know the value of the experiences of working with data. And if they are not able to have students experience collection of data and analysis on their own, then they probably provide them with data sets. And they provide them with experiences that can be as closely matched to those that they would have in a laboratory experience without actually having the manipulatives and being able to participate in that kind of experience. Of course, all of that has to be connected really to the strong content and be an integral part of what they're teaching and not in isolation of what they're teaching. And so even constructing that can be a challenge for some teachers.
So to some extent, it's comparable to Dr. Eisenkraft's opening analogy of they watch baseball, but they don't get to play it.
Exactly.
If any of you could address this, I was fortunate. I ended up with a doctorate in science. Was fortunate to have good science classes along the way with pretty good labs, and can remember my basic physics and chemistry and biology classes, and we had good equipment, even though it was a rural, small, not super wealthy district. But one of my questions is, it seems like we spend money, and NSF has in the past funded the development of curricula. We come up with models, and you folks do good research, and I appreciate the work you did. I've read much of that report. How do we disseminate it, so that actually it has an impact, not just in the schools, but in the teaching institutions, the colleges of education, so that when we understand what works to teach science, it's actually disseminated in some meaningful way? And then how do we sustain it? And I'd open that up to any of the three.
Well, I think that certainly the NRC report on America's Lab Report brings it to people's attention. I think that studies which show that we're not doing as well in science brings it to people's attention. I think the issue you're speaking of on one part is just the lack of a sense of urgency to improve education in America. And this is as much our responsibility as it is your responsibility in Congress and the nation's responsibility, that somehow we can't seem to capture the sense of urgency that I know we all share, that we have to turn this around or it's going to be too late to make the changes. The National Science Foundation does a wonderful job of funding good research, curriculum projects, and what happens is it does get disseminated. People do end up utilizing that research in their teaching, and they look for better direction. The other thing, which is very positive, is that, in fact, the research projects do get incorporated into all forms of curriculum, and the question is, how do we find the best way to communicate this? I think there are meetings, National Science Teachers Association has conferences, I think professional development through teachers, all of these opportunities to get the word out through journals and things like that to teachers and communities. But I think the larger issue is really the sense of urgency.
A societal and cultural issue, not just, the point being, you could do your work and identify the problem, we could pass Mr. Hinojosa's bill, come up with some model programs, but unless the society embraces the mission, it will ultimately not be as successful as it could be. We all have to make choices, as you said in your opening testimony, about where we're going to spend our limited dollars. And often that decision, it's very interesting.
Do we fund a science lab, in fact, where we say, well, we can't have the safety equipment? When we fund a football team, those helmets are $250. Nobody says, well, let's do it without helmets this year, or we'll buy the cheap helmets. They don't skimp there. But somehow in the science lab we skimp. So it's really a question of priorities, urgency. What's the long-range benefits?
Dr. Mundell, you look like you might have a comment.
Oh, I was just suggesting, as far as dissemination of the information, there's work that's being done now throughout Cleveland, at least, of establishing websites where, let's say, where curriculum is basically tested, put out there for the other school teachers in the Cleveland School District. I did some work with NeoSec a couple of years ago where we would actually come up with short, safe experiments that could be done in most classrooms, also inexpensive experiments, and then they'd be posted at the website for teachers to basically access. So that's one way to get some of this information out.
Appreciate that. I have many more questions, but I'll yield now as a courtesy to my good friend and colleague, Mr. Hall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your very kind and thoughtful offers of cooperation. It's not unusual for you to do that, and Bart Garden has also extended the same thing. We have a good committee and a good thing going. Honored to have men as leaders with your outlook and attitude. I look forward to working with you. I have a question of Mrs. Froschauer. Your testimony indicates that a lot of teachers are paying out of pocket for lab equipment. And I know today, and I want to congratulate Mr. Hinojosa on his bill and his usual support and pushing for science and math, and every one of us ought to have our shoulder to the wheel to try to set aside this bad statistics we have of even number of engineers with China, India, many other countries. Just unbelievable distortion there and I don't know who's been negligent in pushing that or pressing for it, but I know we're at that avenue now, and I'm wondering just how we're going to catch up, and it'll be through testimony like yours here and leaders like our chairman and Dr. Ehlers. We have I want to go into this a minute. I know we're focusing on high schools today, but in my own district at Texarkana, Texas, they built a science-focused elementary school, an entire elementary school there. I dedicated it a week ago, I believe, there. And it's very unusual. All the classrooms are labs, and students are exposed to scientific ideas and concepts early in their educational life. And it's a joint venture between Texas A&M, Texas A&M Texarkana, and the Texarkana School District. And teachers at the elementary school and A&M graduate students and professors work together to develop curricula and to mentor students and create an innovative lab experience. And I thank the committee and the chairman for bringing these witnesses here today to tell us why they think lab science is important and how they believe a true partnership between NSF, educational institution, and industry can work together to create the same type of innovative lab science experience in high school. But it's kind of hard for me to understand why teachers are paying out of their own pockets, and why aren't states and school districts providing funds for lab equipment? Is there some state law? Do certain states have certain laws that they can't invade that province? Are they using it all for the athletic thrust, or which is kind of suggested there by some of your testimony? Are there federal programs already available to help the purchase of lab equipment for schools? Ms. Froschauer?
Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Hall. Actually, teachers have been paying from their own pockets for many years, not just in science, but some teachers are even buying pencils for their students. It's exacerbated by the topics that we cover in science and by the cost of hands-on manipulatives as well as consumables that makes it an unusually large amount of money, particularly for science teachers. There's no law against giving teachers money to buy equipment, but it seems that right now, in particular, there's a great deal of emphasis on other subject areas and not as much emphasis on science. And you probably realize that English and math has more emphasis currently than does science, and so there are more resources that are going into those subject areas, especially at the elementary level, than is going into science. What PALS is going to do for us is it's going to provide us with research, much needed research, on how labs are utilized and what is needed for quality laboratory experiences for students in high school. However, that research can also impact and influence what's happening in middle schools and then, of course, elementary schools as well. And if we're going to expand this resolution, we could expand it and add a lot more money to it and perhaps consider researching into middle schools as well. But high school is a great place to start, and it will provide us with the kind of research that we need. We have many questions, and they can be addressed through PALS.
Are there federal programs already available to help with the purchase of lab equipment for schools, and how does Congressman Hinojosa's bill work in with that? Is there already a program that he's adding to?
I have no knowledge of any program that he's adding to.
Well, if other federal programs already exist, I just wonder how this legislation we're considering today is going to be an extension of those programs, or how it works in with it. Do any of the three of you have that answer?
This is independent of anything else that's happening.
Well, I think it's a great thrust, and I guess I'll ask all the witnesses, is a lack of laboratory equipment a bigger problem than adequate teacher training, and how to use these labs, to teach teachers using labs?
It's hard to say which one you would put first. Absolutely, teachers need a great deal more training, but even with training, what do you do if you don't have the equipment? And if you're given the equipment and you don't have the training, you don't know what to do with it either. So both of them go very much hand in hand. Both are vitally important.
Well, I think it's a good time, and I think the Congressman has a great time to introduce his bill, because I feel an urge and a move to support teachers rather than to suppress them, and put them first on an agenda, because we're seeking math and science and trying to catch up. Even on Social Security thrust, I've been voting for extra Social Security for teachers to pay them for that we didn't pay them for the last 50 years. I'm not sure that I'm on sound ground dipping into the Social Security fund, because it's supposed to go broke sometime in the next 10 or 15 years. But there is a move toward teachers and appreciation of teachers, just like 9/11 brought us to really appreciate firemen and policemen. You know, it brought us a new look at them. I think there's a new look at education, a new look at science, and a new look at those of you who delve a little bit further than the normal, ordinary school teacher. I'm of a school teaching family. My only wife, my only sister, my only mother were all teachers. I was a school superintendent at one time, and I just know that we're at a time when the timing's right on his bill, and I sure support it and going to be a co-sponsor on it if I'm not already. But I just wonder if there's already a federal government program. Are we already putting some money in there? If we are, is this more? Is this going to support it? Does this add to it? I think those are things we'll probably have some testimony on later, Mr. Chairman. I think my time's up. I yield back, and I thank you very much for the time. Dr. Ehlers, thank you for letting me go. I got a teacher I got to meet up in my office right now in a few minutes. She's my sister.
I thank Superintendent Hall for his testimony. We learn something new about Ralph every day, and it's always a delight. Mr. Carnahan will return in a moment. In his absence, I'll yield 5 minutes to Dr. Ehlers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Dr. Eisenkraft, rather. I was interested in your Olympics analogy, and yes, obviously, if our feelings were that publicly known, we'd take action. But they are certainly well known. I think people are catching on, but the problem is deeper than that, because a recent poll of parents asked them whether they thought it was more important for kids to learn more math and science. And almost universally they said, yes, we definitely need that. Then they were asked if they thought their kids were learning enough. Oh yeah, they're learning enough. In other words, they know it in a theoretical sense, but not in a practical, absolute sense. Dr. Eisenkraft, one of your conclusions was that due to a lack of a standardized definition of a lab, it's very hard to measure the impact of lab experiences on learning. In view of that statement, and also, and that's why in particular I wanted to refer to Carl Wyman's work, which is about simulation rather than labs. What do you think of that? What kind of work would be necessary to implement successful lab experiences? What kind of research do you think has to be done? And would you see that being done under the auspices of this bill or not?
Well, thank you, Congressman Ellis. The question about the definition of labs, we required a definition because it was very difficult for us to interpret all of the research which has been done. People were defining labs in all sorts of ways or not defining, and so you're trying to say, are these research reports telling us the same thing? And it wasn't obvious because they weren't defining labs the same way. So the definition, which seems to have hit some resonance with the community that's in the NRC report, speaks to a way of defining labs so that we can then begin a research agenda and answer some of the questions that are noted there. We certainly want to know, because of the expense and the time and all sorts of concerns having to do with labs, is that money being well spent? How does it result in student achievement, student interest in science, student motivations, the understanding the processes of science? How does it help us in terms of people moving into STEM careers? And we have to look at different elements of that. But the lab itself, as the report says, cannot be an isolated portion of the environment. So what happens too often is a teacher in a school which does have labs, they end up going to the lab when it's available. So I'll go 2 weeks ahead before I teach the topic, or I'll go 3 weeks after I taught the topic, or I'll go when somebody else isn't using the equipment. Instead of saying, no, we have learning models, instructional models, which help people to understand better, that we know help with student achievement. The idea is that you go to the lab so that you can have experiences, take data, and then draw conclusions on data you've taken, and then see, how did I interpret it? How did the scientists interpret it? Is it the same way? How do I get over a misconception? So the question is, when you do a lab experiment, there are a number of different factors you can do research on. Certainly, there's the content question, there's the affective domain, interest in science. Do you want to take more science? I think the questions that Dr. Mundell asked his students, was the lab an integral part of your program? What did it mean to do a lab? Was a lab actually you doing it, or was it you watching somebody else do it? So there's a host of questions. Carl Wyman served on the committee with us, and it was a wonderful privilege. And I've known him for a number of years, and he's extremely dedicated to education. And his generosity of his time and actually his Nobel money to help create those simulations is quite an inspiration, I think, to all scientists. The question is, when you provide simulations, this report did not speak to that. Could simulations replace laboratory experiments? It's not part of the research. It was not part of our charge. There is a question, though, of that simulation in helping people understand as part of a larger integrated program. But we could do simulations of all sorts of experiments on computers, but the scientists don't do that now. They still say, no, I have to go into the lab. I have to get dirty to make sure I understand what nature is telling me, not what some programmer is telling me. So there's probably, there's not one tool for one job, but this idea of the integrated instructional unit, the good instructional model which uses direct instruction, labs, computer simulations, but in a way that we know enhanced education is what it's all about, and we have to do research on that to show it can be done. It's been shown in small studies. What I think this bill allows us to do is to scale it up to a larger program to show it can be effective, and then we hope people will take notice and say, I want to do that. And then people come on board with the schools of education and in the high schools.
Well, thank you. And I have a follow-up, but my time has expired. So.
Go ahead.
Oh, my follow-up is just based on what you just said. And this I would like to address to all witnesses. Is the lack of laboratory equipment a bigger problem? I'm sorry, let me restate it. We've been fighting very hard to maintain an educational mission at the National Science Foundation, and it's been a very tough goal because that portion of the budget has been decreasing year by year. I think we have finally reversed it through exercising every bit of political clout that we have. But now the question is, this bill comes along. This is going to be a pilot program, and probably the best place for it is NSF in terms of doing a pilot program, doing the evaluation, which NSF is very good at, and so forth. Where do you think it's most appropriately housed at NSF? And secondly, if it proves to be a good program, should it still be housed at NSF, or should it be moved over to Department of Education or handled in some other way? So we'll go backwards. This time, Dr. Mundell, you want to start first?
If they're passing to me, I can certainly speak to it.
Okay, I'll let you.
No, NSF is
speak
certainly
first.
the right place to kick off this study. The Directorate of Science, the Directorate of the Research in K-12 now, the new Directorate of Research K-12, but the Department of Educational Curriculum Development or Instructional Materials Development. They changed their names, but Instructional Materials Development, DRK-12 is the new proposal. They've put together the $43 million that way. No, they certainly have the expertise. They have the peer review. They can find the quality studies that have to be done because of that expertise from all the possibilities that are out there. The question is, what happens when the bill gets passed? So we'll be optimistic here, and we have some follow-up studies over the next few years, and we get money, and we show that this can be effective, and we recognize the importance of this for all students. So we have to make sure that students in impoverished areas, minority students, get this opportunity to do labs. And we find out that in the affluent schools, that the students who didn't perform well academically, they should also get an opportunity to have labs. Then, labs are expensive. This kickoff $5 million is very nice for a small section of Boston, much less the United States. When you're talking about the kind of magnitude that different reports brought before this committee, the Gathering Storm, whatever, have talked about in terms of the money needed, I don't know who should handle that kind of money or how it's best allocated. But to turn around science labs in America is an expensive venture.
Yes, and that's where I wanted to look at the next step. Should it stay at NSF with its limited funds, in which case we could try to increase funding, or move it to the Department of Education and have them handle it, or maybe the Defense Department, since they have all the money.
I think the peer review process is a very important component of having quality research done. And I think that NSF is best situated to do that quality research at this point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. Mr. Carnahan, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be here for this inaugural hearing, and congratulations again to you and to the ranking member. I think you're going to bring some very much needed bipartisan leadership in this research area. I guess I just want to also say it's great to see the emphasis on the committee adding the science education into the title. I think it really deserves that, and again makes a strong statement that that's going to be an important focus of the subcommittee and the full committee. I'm fortunate. I come from, I don't have the science background like these other gentlemen have, trained as a lawyer. Don't hold that against me. But my area in St. Louis has some of the top public and private research institutions in the country. This is very important to them. You don't have to convince me. I mean, we've seen all the studies that talk about how we're lagging behind. We've seen how important it is to capture the students early and get that interest perked. I've heard from the business community how they're worried about the workforce of the future. I guess my question, and one of the things that's been frustrating to me is, while all these things seem so obvious and necessary, there tends to be this kind of general hesitancy of people in the science community to get involved in politics. And I don't know if that's just a characteristic of people that are in science or engineering, but how can we do a better job? Because I've talked to many different science and engineering groups about how important it is for them to speak up in terms of this public policy debate. And I guess my question is, how can we best really mobilize and make the case to the scientists and the engineers and the teachers to get involved in this debate so they can do a better job?
Well, this is one way to do it, isn't it?
It is.
And actually, I believe that you will see that teachers are becoming more involved politically, that we do realize the importance of legislation that can support the efforts and the things that we are doing in the classroom every day. And without the strong legislation, that we probably cannot accomplish our goals to really teach all children well. And so and I think that NCLB actually has helped some of that, by the way, because it's really put it out front. It put something in front of us that was legislative that now we are focusing on, and so we realize the power of legislation. Certainly, teachers are not the most vocal people when it comes to individuals and pronouncing what their needs are. Obviously, we would have more in education, I believe, if they were, but I do believe that they are moving forward. NSTA actually just started our legislative efforts within the last couple of decades. We were not that legislatively alert, and we were not paying attention to what was going on the Hill the way we should have been. But our members really had an outcry and said, we need to get involved. We need to find out about the bills that are being passed on the Hill and what kinds of things are happening to us legislatively. And that's why we now have a very strong legislative component.
Well, thank you for getting your group involved. I really appreciate that.
Just to mention, the National Science Teachers Association will have about 15,000 science teachers coming to St. Louis in a few weeks to learn about science and to advocate for better instruction. I think that members, your colleagues, Congressman Naylors, Congressman Baird, Congressman Holt, I mean, these are scientists who have made this transition and recognize the importance of politics. Most scientists don't understand how it works. They're very good at doing their bench science, but it just makes sense. School teachers, it just makes sense you should support education. I don't understand what we're supposed to do out there. How do you convince people when it makes sense to everybody? And so we don't know how to do that. And I think teachers in general are very shy about getting involved in politics because they play this very sensitive role with children, and they have to keep their personal views to themselves as they explain scientific concepts to their students. And for them to take on an advocacy role, often they find that in conflict with their primary responsibility of teaching, and they think that if they get caught up in politics, that might detract from what they're supposed to be doing. It's not true. I mean, we all have to be involved in our communities, involved in the national dilemma. But the question of how do you become an advocate and how do you do that and how do you make that step, I think for most scientists, most teachers, we don't know how. We just say, everybody agrees with us. We need better schools. We need better teaching. We need more equipment. We need labs. What more can we, if everybody understands it, how do we get them to do it? That's the part that I think you're asking, but why don't teachers move to the next step, scientists move to the next step? I don't think they know how. Thatcher?
Yes, thank you, sir. Well, part of what I'm doing here is kind of representing the university community and how we're affected by this. And one of the questions I was directed and the information I got was, how do I assess this problem? The assessment is in our decline of enrollment, retention of our students, okay, Our minorities are down to about a 44% retention rate at CSU. And a lot of this goes by the lack of preparation and foundation they have when they come into our university. And I have a feeling this is probably a widespread phenomenon. But anyway, I think that part of this can come out, but part of the support for this can come out is out of the university community. We are taking an interest in Cleveland, and I imagine elsewhere there are too, of trying to smooth transitions from high school into college, and also working more with secondary school teachers as well as middle school teachers. As a matter of fact, every summer for the last several years, I've been teaching chemistry to middle school teachers for their licensure. What I'd just like to say about this is I feel like this is part of the movement to get things more into the public's consciousness, is that coming out of the community universities and community colleges, they're concerned for where their students are coming from and why they're so poorly equipped to start the rigors of college academia. Anything you want to add to that? Or? Okay, thank you.
Well, I just want to close by saying thank you all for being here and working with your networks and your organizations to really encourage that, because I think to the extent we can encourage more scientists and engineers to speak out as part of this public policy discussion and to make the case, it really helps the public policy makers in pushing that, making it a priority here in Washington and in state and local governments around the country. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Carnahan. I thank the witnesses. I want to ask a series of follow-up questions, if I may, and I know Dr. Ehlers has a couple more as well. I want to do a little housekeeping. First of all, Dr. Ehlers was mentioned that by using all the political clout we have, we've been able to reverse some of the decline in funding and some of the redirection. I want to give Dr. Ehlers credit for some of that, along with the chair of this committee, Dr. Gordon. Together, it's the two of them who've really led the fight in that, and they deserve the credit and, frankly, the thanks of the scientific community for their leadership in that. They certainly have my gratitude. I also want to mention that a resource for science teachers is the website of this very committee. Last year, this committee made a big push to try to provide science research or science teaching and experiential tools on its website. I don't know if we have a link to the physics program Dr. Ehlers referenced, but we should try to add at least a link to that. So I would encourage you to perhaps let your fellow teachers know, especially at this upcoming convention. I was hoping, Dr. Eisenkraft, that you were going to say that 15,000 teachers were descending not on St. Louis, but was it St. Louis you said? But on Washington, D.C. You're in the wrong town. St. Louis is a lovely place, but...
As I said, we don't quite know how to do it.
Yes, well, we need some geography teachers.
Mr. Chairman, they're coming to my hometown.
Oh, sorry, but I see why that was... Well, it's a fine place, St. Louis, and they've got some great representatives, as you know. But I mean it actually fairly seriously, Ms. Froschauer, if every member of Congress who had teachers in the kind of straits that you've described from the testimonials you reported to us knew that, I think we'd be appalled. And I think many members may not know the condition of those schools. I make it a personal point to visit every high school in my district every 2 years if I can. It's some 40 plus, almost 50 schools. And I think they're relatively well equipped. I confess I haven't been to the science labs of all of them, but I've been to the schools. But if your teachers are in those straits, please encourage them to let their member of Congress know that. Because from my perspective, and you know, as we reference a lot in this committee, we'll reference it many more times, the Beyond the Gathering Storm report. One of the fairly soft, but I found intriguing proposals alluded to in there is the notion of a voluntary national science curriculum, where you take best practices and it becomes a voluntary national curriculum. And part of why I feel so interested in that is that you heard, I thought, compelling testimony by Mr. Hinojosa about how a relatively disadvantaged area can just fall off the radar screen. In an ideal world, in an ideal country, let's not say world necessarily, but in an ideal country at least, your access to quality science education should not depend on the accident of where your parents happen to live or work. Every kid should have access to equal quality education. And one of the things that intrigues me about a voluntary national curriculum would be that possibly we could use research like that defined in Mr. Hinojosa's experience, some of the work Dr. Eisenkraft has done, come up with a national curriculum, pair the teaching pedagogy with the equipment, and those schools that participate would have access to that. I'd welcome your thoughts on whether that's a dumb idea or a good idea or what the problems might be, and then open that up to anybody.
One of the problems right now with what's happening with science curriculum is that, as you probably realize, we have a couple of documents that really do provide us with the structure of the content. And those two documents are the National Science Education Standards and Benchmarks for Science Literacy out of Project 2061 with AAAS. Those two documents really are the documents that have been used by the states as now they have addressed curriculum issues, content issues, and curriculum issues for NCLB. And so now we have states who have also developed their own set of standards, benchmarks, frameworks, what they're calling them a variety of different things. And so we have a lot of people who've come up with a variety of solutions to what they believe is good science. And I believe they will fight for their beliefs in what is good science. And so, as you can probably imagine, it would be very difficult to come up with a national curriculum per se. However, there is a problem that we think can be addressed. Right now, through Benchmarks for Science Literacy and National Science Education Standards, we have many, many points that bullet points that need to be addressed within the science curriculum, content specific. Too much. No one can possibly teach everything that's in those documents because they're so hefty, there's so much there. And so what we believe can be done that might help teachers a great deal is to narrow those points down into a more manageable number, something that we really consider the essential anchors of science education, and that might help teachers. So not quite the national curriculum that you're thinking about, but if there were a manageable number of content points or anchors that teachers were looking at, then they could develop around them a richer curriculum rather than trying to spread out the curriculum over many points.
Especially as we talk about lab experience, and Dr. Ehlers and I probably got lots of first-hand experience with this. When you look at these bullet points, it seems like the notion behind teaching science is to make sure we've covered certain key topic areas. To be perfectly honest, my own experience, it would be far less important to cover all the topic areas than to give me a hands-on experience with the process and the way of solving and approaching problems that involves hypothesis generation, data review, hypothesis generation, study design, hypothesis test, data analysis, report, etc. If I do that a few times, I can apply that to all the other realms, that general structure, and that will be far more useful to me conceptually throughout my lifespan than would memorizing a particular set of answers to a broad array. Is that the kind of point you're making?
Yeah, yes, and I appreciate your point of saying cover all of the points, the bullet points that are identified. The specificity makes it to a point where you can't even cover them even close to being well covered. And covering is not what this is about. This is conceptual understanding. You cannot develop conceptual understanding on all of those points, and we want conceptual understanding, and so that's why we need these very specific anchors that are the essentials of the science curriculum.
But if all those points are now set out as the 477 commandments now, or whatever they tantamount to, and if they're going to be incorporated in the NCLB testing, the fear of God is now on the school boards and the science teachers, I would assume, and feeling they have to gear up to cover that stuff, possibly at the expense of laboratory experience?
Very possibly. Very possibly.
I would hope not, though.
My fear is, are we having unintended consequences?
Well, I think that there are unintended consequences. The question is when the states produce exams in order to meet the requirements of No Child Left Behind, or the federal government produces a voluntary exam that you might want to do, the quality of that exam will drive the curriculum. So if that exam only asks questions about what does this mean, fact, and doesn't talk about the processes of science, how do we know, then of course teachers are going to move and say, forget these ways of teaching which talk about process, which talk about experiments. Let's just give a lot of worksheets and get the facts, because that's all that's really required, and we want to protect ourselves. So the formation of the exams and the quality of questions there drives the curriculum. And so we have to ensure that when the states do give exams, that we make sure that those exams reflect what we want students to know in science, as you enumerated.
Dr. Ehlers.
Thank you very much. Just, first of all, a comment on some of the discussion you just had. And it always struck me when I taught laboratories that very often students would do the laboratory experiment and come to me and show me the result and say, is this the right answer? And I would always tell them, no matter what you got, it's the right answer, because that's what you got from doing the experiment and making the measurements. They felt extremely uncomfortable with that. Sometimes I'd tell them about the experience I had in my first physics lab at the college level, when we were supposed to measure the coefficient of heat expansion of rods. Each given rod, temperature, the thermometers, temperature, all that. And I measured it, and the rod, as I heated it, the rod contracted. And somehow that didn't seem good, so I repeated the measurement. I got the same answer. So I went to the instructor and said, I've observed a very interesting phenomenon. And he said, that can't be. So he did the experiment and got the same result. Apparently a maverick instructor at one point had ordered a special material rod just to confuse the students and test them. And this particular instructor didn't even know about it. But the point is simply, the answer you get is the right answer. Now, you may have to worry about uncertainties, etc., but it's very hard to convey that to students. One of the first things we will face if we put this bill out and goes to the floor, colleagues will say, oh, new program. We don't have any money for new programs. That could stop it in its track. Question I have for you, based on your vast knowledge, do you know of any similar program that we could somehow integrate this into so that it does not appear to be a new program? This, would you consider this just out of the blue, totally new, or is there something else we could tie it into?
I'm unclear on what you mean. The bill?
Yes. Yeah,
No, I think that most of the legislation and funding for improved laboratories often goes to universities and colleges. I don't think it often goes to high schools. I think that's usually left to the district or the city or whatever. But we have inroads into this. I mean, people recognize the need. Los Angeles Unified School District, with 700,000 students, decided 3 years ago to provide lab experiences to all of their ninth graders at great expense, recognizing it, and then to begin a program of professional development for all of their 360 ninth grade science teachers in order to help them to do this effectively. Whether Los Angeles can then, after providing this quality experience in ninth grade, can you find the money then for 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade? That's the question. I mean, but I don't think I know of programs which specifically target money for investigation of labs and equipment and to test these instructional models. Certainly, there are parts of other NSF programs where this is a small part of it, but not the major directive. Not saying no, labs are important enough for us to get behind and figure out what works and what doesn't.
That raises the next point relating to this question. I asked that for a reason, because perhaps the best approach is to modify the bill so that all programs are tied to universities. Grants are given to universities to work with local schools. In other words, it's combined grant request. Do you think that would be an appropriate approach to use on this, particularly in view of the evaluation requirements, which most university faculty who are used to getting grants would know how to do the evaluation properly. Maybe high schools would not. Any comments on that?
Well, part of the partnership within the bill is for university involvement.
Yeah.
And you're suggesting that perhaps the funding would go to the university to conduct the
I'm
research?
suggesting perhaps we broaden it with a principal investigator being at a college or a university and,
but not taking it out of NSF.
not taking it on an
Because
NSF, no. Continue to be an NSF program,
Yeah.
because there are similar programs in the NSF for that, but not specifically related to laboratory work.
I'm not sure how to micromanage that. I think the legislation right now speaks to some kind of partnership between university, high school, and industry. I think that's a wonderful concept, and I would really leave it to the National Science Foundation to write up a request for proposals which could take into account all of these different possibilities so they can weigh the merits of, well, if the university is the PI, how much money is going to the high schools, what will be the most effective, how is the research done? So I don't know if it's a simple answer.
There are no simple answers in Washington, but this may be a simpler approach to take finally. So, thank you.
Yes, sir, can I add something to that?
Yeah, Dr.
I always felt that what we need to have is more of a presence of the urban university or urban college in the school systems. And I think by this kind of partnership that we're discussing right now, that would kind of lend itself to that sort of a presence of having not only develop a curriculum, but also have, university faculty being more of a presence physically within the public schools. So I'd be very much in favor of that type of thing. How the funding actually works, I have no idea about that aspect of it. Would be the best way to do it.
Another option might be perhaps that we make the partners, or have the industrial partners, whoever they might be, responsible for handling the equipment purchases, and the university or the school be responsible for paying the training for the teachers. I'm just looking for handles to restructure so that it fits better within NSF, but also makes it easier to get it passed into law.
It's very possible that the research coming out of the math-science partnerships over the past few years with the National Science Foundation could better inform us about what happens when you create a partnership, so we know how to use the money most effectively in the future.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. I have one last question, and then perhaps we'll conclude the hearing for today. I was trained in addition to clinical psychology, I managed to go to the University of Utah and learn how to be a ski instructor as well. And it strikes me, actually, that maybe the instruction I got as a ski instructor may be better in some ways than what people get as science teachers. And the reason I say this is this: any ski instructor in America who's certified has a certain core curriculum that they know, a certain sequence of skill development and exercises designed to achieve those skills, and the equipment is fairly standard because everybody's got their skis and boots and poles, and they go through that, and you're taught that. So you don't just say, well, you can ski pretty good, go teach people how to do what you do. That's not how it works. First you teach this technique, then this. So my question is, does that happen in our colleges of education? In other words, if I'm going to if I'm in a college of education and I'm trained to be an 8th grade science teacher and my specialty area is physics, let's say, or biology, pick it, what doesn't matter, do I get trained in a series of activities and accompanying materials and exercises that have in some way been tested and demonstrated effective, and I will then convey that knowledge and through those exercises to the students? Is that what happens, or what? That's how it seems like it ought to happen to me. I don't know if it does.
I think Lee Schulman and Linda Darling-Hammond working on this will tell you that happens in the best colleges and universities training teachers, and doesn't happen in many of them. And that's another question that I think, how much is devoted to labs? Do we know how to teach effectively? So that's a whole different area that, again, the Carnegie Foundation is looking at very closely. How do we make teaching a profession in the same way that engineers get trained or lawyers get trained
Or ski instructors
get trained. And I'm sure we can all learn from one another. But there's you know, but anyway, it's another issue. And yes, the best schools do. We do know that research has shown that when you work with teachers, if you tie that professional development to the curriculum they're doing in their class, it's more effective than when you have generic. And I think that that's speaking toward something you're saying. So if they're teaching curriculum A in their class, and you gear the professional development toward curriculum A, there's less of a jump for that teacher to be able to transfer that knowledge to their classroom, and it's more effective.
Yeah, for me it would be I've talked to a number of teachers and faculty in the discipline-based majors in academia, and the difference for me would be, it's one thing if you teach me about neutrinos, let's say, and maybe that's not the best thing. Let's take something more simple, Newton's laws, so basic laws of mechanics. So you're teaching about those conceptually. If you want to make a good teacher of that, you then say, okay, so here's the concept. How do you convey that concept and why it matters to the kids? So you link the content-specific area from the discipline-based portions of a university directly with the teaching curriculum. Is that being done in places? Because that seems to me to be the best way to do it.
That's an interesting instructional model, and it's part of good instructional models, but it's not all. It's Congressman Naylor said nothing is simple in Washington, and in education either.
I've been in academia. We both have.
So I think my colleague and mentor Cliff Schwartz used to say, elementary education is no simpler than elementary particles. For your neutrino example, it's a complex world. We certainly, the question about whether activities precede concepts, concepts preceding vocabulary, all of those elements. How do you engage students intellectually? What does that research say? All of these come together for strong instructional programs.
When I referred to academia as being dismal, I didn't necessarily mean it's all dismal, but trying to get a logic to why curricula are what they are can be a very astonishing process. Dr. Reeders, any other questions? With that, before I bring the hearing to close, I want to thank our witnesses for testifying before the committee today and for your work beyond today. You've all worked in distinguished careers and contributed in so many ways. We're grateful for you sharing your expertise. If there's no objection, the record will remain open for additional statements from the members and for answers to any follow-up questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. Without objection, so ordered. And this brings the hearing to close. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you very much.